The Embodied Performance Podcast, Episode 23. I'm Nick Markey, Beach Barbell, Physical Therapy and Performance and Strength Training in Wilmington, North Carolina. Today, I'm going to talk about what strength training is and different types. If you look at when someone says exercise in a way is just doing something maybe that's similar to normal activities, but kind of outside of the norm and perhaps with the goal of just performing those activities. Like you might say a military exercise is where the soldiers are practicing different maneuvers and whatnot in a way to maybe hone their skill, but with the direct goal is practicing those skills. Whereas if they were actually performing those maneuvers, their goal is to perform, some task and not to focus on necessarily the skill. So when you think of exercise from a physical point of view, you're kind of going out of your way to practice some skill, like say that you go out for a walk. You're specifically practicing walking for its own sake, versus if you went to the store and were walking around, you're walking around because your goal is to shop. So similar movement and skill, but the intention is a little differently. So obviously exercise comes in myriad of forms, and one of those forms you can call would be strength training or maybe resistance training. And when you throw in the training element, there is some modicum of maybe methodology or methodical nature of applying this particular exercise. Same thing like with if you're training for running, you probably have some sort of program that you're following. And strength training kind of falls under a similar type thing where you have a certain program you're following, whatever that program may be, and we'll talk about different styles and types in that nature of strength training today. Because the reason why I make this distinction is that reality is exercise is just, doing activity. So you can kind of go do activity that's just whatever, free willy-nilly, and that just makes you a little tired, and that could be fine. But when you add in the idea of training, the thought behind that is that you're kind of honing the intention more and applying some sort of overlying program to it. Kind of maybe like a blurry distinction, but what you sometimes see with exercise programs that kind of look almost like stuff thrown at the wall and whatever sticks is it's just 30 to 60 minutes of getting somebody tired. And there's an old saying in exercise fitness field that any fool can get another fool tired. It's just moving around for 30 to 60 minutes at some vigorous pace will get you tired, and there is benefit to that, but perhaps progression may not be is easily attainable if there's not really some sort of program in place to push forward in terms of progression. Okay, I think I beat that down enough. So strength training, or maybe called resistance training, comes in different forms. Essentially, it's just moving your body and or equipment against gravity. So like I said before, gravity is just pushing you down to the ground. Eventually gravity beats us all, and we all go back down to the earth. But, strength training is a way to basically fight that gravity for as long as possible and perhaps keep you upright as long as possible. And that's one of my main goals for why I strength train. So if you look at strength training, you have different forms like body weight or calisthenics. So that would be things like push-ups, sit-ups, leg raises, planks, pull-ups, dips, inverted rows, bridges, air squats. You could probably throw in maybe just squat jumps and things like that. Basically, you're not using any extra equipment except maybe like some bar somewhere. So obviously you see some parks that have like bars and little kind of calisthenic areas set up for people to exercise on. But in reality, you could jump up and hold onto a ledge and do a pull-up, So the idea behind calisthenics is that it's equipment free or light, or maybe like, environmental equipment. And it's got a lot of positives. Obviously, the biggest positive would be, anyone can join into it because it's got a low barrier to entry. You're basically just moving your body against gravity. So like if somebody was really, really out of shape, maybe they just start with like what's called a sit to stand, where they just start sitting in a chair and stand up and sit down. So there's a good body weight exercise to start working out your legs and back and hips. But doing a wall push-up, there's another form of it, just a modified push-up. And then it runs the gamut all the way to, essentially kind of like more maybe gymnastics types moves where maybe doing pull-ups, and then you're doing chest to bar, and then maybe like a muscle up where you kind of fly, pull yourself up super fast and kind of up over the bar, and then push yourself up all the way upright. So stuff you might see like in gymnasts do. So you can probably kind of lump all that into calisthenics and body weight. And it was probably the first form of strength training, obviously, because, before we had standardized equipment, I'm sure, at some point, ancient Greeks and whatnot started, picking up rocks and lifting them over their head. And I'm sure they've even created little devices, easily, you can start with weights, could just be a pair of sticks and some rocks or something. You could see that sometimes with, third world countries, people will use, some dowel and then throw some cement blocks on each side and use that to lift, weights. So, but yeah, so body weights, calisthenics, good entry point, and good to, probably incorporate into a program, because typically, since you're not using equipment, you're going to be, whatever the part you're working is, it's going to be weight bearing. So for instance, like if I do a bench press, I'm pushing the weight away from me. So I'm not necessarily weight bearing. It's just how it affects your body is going to be a little differently versus like a push-up, which you are similarly working the chest and triceps, but with a push-up, you are, pushing the ground away from you. You're pushing the earth away from you, but you're weight bearing down. So there is something to be said about that weight bearing aspect, that can sometimes be provide just maybe a little different stimulus. And so when you're doing strength training, it may not be a bad idea to do, if you have access to equipment, that you can do a majority of it with equipment, because you have I think it's just not necessarily easier. It's sometimes easier to set up and maybe more efficient with what you're doing, but it's not a bad idea to incorporate that other body weight element where, your arms are pushing, your hands are contacting the ground and your body's having to stabilize that. So then other types of strength training. So obviously you have weightlifting. So there's a variety within that. So you have more power type movements. So at the lowest form, that could just be without weights, just squat jumps, lunge hops, single leg jumps, in various directions. So that's kind of like what they call more plyometric. So that's quick jumps and moves and whatnot. And then power training, you're starting to incorporate some resistance to it. So sometimes people will use bands with this. So like they'll do a squat jump with bands attached to the ground, and then like maybe over a harness or their shoulders, and then they jump against that. So that's would be a form of resistance because the band's trying to pull you down. You can do a similar move with holding, weights in your hands or a barbell on your shoulders, up towards Olympic lifting, which is traditionally just called weightlifting, where you're doing the weights starting on the ground and you're pulling it up really fast and, lifting it up to your shoulders or lifting it up overhead. And there's some different details with that, but basically that's Olympic lifting, is you're picking up a weight off the ground and, either throwing it up over, lifting it up over your head or lifting it up to your shoulders and then overhead. You can also do things with like medicine balls, where you're throwing the medicine ball in various directions, throwing it as far as you can forward, throwing it up, squatting down and throwing it up. And you can also do various core type exercises where you kind of go back, like you're doing a sit up and then sit up and throw the ball, maybe with a partner. So various forms of that kind of power type training. So power just meaning that you're doing work over a quick amount of time. So you're typically not going to have as much weight if you're focusing on more power, because you're trying to preserve as much speed as possible while doing the heavy weight. So it's a trade-off. The heavier the weight gets, the slower you're going to move. So the idea would be you're trying to maybe find what's the most amount of weight that you can still move maybe just as fast or near as fast as without the weight. So I'd be looking at it from an athletic stance. Olympic weightlifting, if you're just doing it for maybe just general athletics or power, then you wouldn't go as heavy as maybe like a professional weightlifter would do. Then you have more strength type training with squats with a barbell or deadlifts, bench press, overhead press, rows, various implements you can do this with. Obviously you have barbells, which is just a long bar and then weights on each side of it. Dumbbells, which are just basically like a short barbell, and you're holding it in one hand generally. And so the trade-off there is with the barbell, it's much more stable because generally both hands are on it, pushing it. So you can most likely push more total with the barbell than if you combine, holding two dumbbells and the weight that those add up to. But the pro of the dumbbell would be that you are going to have to work on maybe more accessory stability because it is less stable because you're just holding it in one hand and there's more freedom for that dumbbell to move. So it's not a bad idea to vary up your different movements. And I think maybe tomorrow I'll talk about just maybe the basic movements that would make up a program for just general strength training. So barbell, dumbbell, kettlebells, which have gotten really popular in the last few years. Kettlebells are just a heavy weighted ball with a loop on top that you can hold. So different people, there's what they call kettlebell swings, where you kind of hinge forward, and I'll talk about that more tomorrow. But so you basically lean forward, but kind of at the hips, and then the weight goes underneath you, and then you pull yourself up really quickly to kind of throw that kettlebell up, either up to your shoulder height or up overhead. And you could also do things like you could do a squat with holding the kettlebell at your chest, and different, basically the same movements you would do with a barbell and dumbbell, but you could do with a kettlebell and holding the kettlebell in different ways. One of the hardest ones would be like trying to lift the kettlebell over your head with, like you might hold a dumbbell and then do like a shoulder press and punch straight up overhead. But with a kettlebell, you can hold it more like that, like a dumbbell, and it's similar. Or you can try to hold the kettlebell up with the weighted portion facing up. And so you're basically having to balance that by where you're holding the loop on the bottom. And so like the kettlebell, you have to have very good balance in terms of holding that kettlebell steady so that you can lift it up over. So obviously the trade-off is that you're not going to do near as much weight as you would with a dumbbell. So with that kind of lift, but you're going to maybe target some more stability type skill with it. So not something I think I would do all the time, but it could be a good variation for somebody. And then there's various rep ranges and schemes that probably deserves its own podcast as well. So maybe this is what I'll do. Tomorrow I'll talk about the different main movements to focus on and different ideas and exercises you can do with those. And then maybe then Friday, for the last podcast for the week, I'll do one on rep ranges and why you might choose different rep ranges for different goals and whatnot. So I think that's probably a good place to stop here or this is probably the longest podcast I've had so far, a little over 17 minutes now. But basically, you have strength training, just moving your body and or equipment against gravity. And then you have the different types kind of within that. You have more power, and then you have more strength, quote unquote strength type, where you're, lifting the weight up and down. So maybe you're not worried as much about the speed, but you're kind of focused on the weight or the reps that you're doing. And then the different sort of equipment. Of course, I didn't mention other equipment, like there's machines that are typically just a pulley with a weight stack. So those can sometimes be good in terms of often giving a different stimulus, different challenge to the person. And then there's cables. I really like cables. Cables will give you kind of similar resistance as you're moving from the end point to the starting point, because you're pulling the cable and it's attached to a pulley. So it's just a different kind of machine. And then of course I mentioned before, there's resistance bands, which give you that variable resistance. So they're weak when they're short, and then as you pull them and they get longer and they stretch, they get stronger. So you can do various things with those as well. So lots of variations. You can basically, if you look at any one movement, like we'll talk about tomorrow, you can probably throw in, tons of variations. So you really, in my opinion, can never get bored, because you could always try a slightly different variation. And then if you throw in rep ranges and things of that nature, then you're looking at tons of variations. And I'll do the math in my head later, but you're doing tons of different variations that may kind of help overcome that boredom fatigue, or maybe help with, without getting too used to one thing. Okay. So I'm going to end this before I get to 20 minutes. Thank you very much for listening. Again, I'm Nick Markey, Beach Barbell, physical therapy and performance and strength training in Wilmington, North Carolina. Gym coming very soon. Thank you. Bye.